hello, everyone. This is our third look at a series that we're calling Dividing Lines. So we're looking at things that have policies and legislation and laws that have divided us in the past, and how we can take what we've learned and try to make things a little bit less divided. So our host for this series is Anthony Orlando. And for those of you who have not already followed us, Anthony is an assistant professor in finance, real estate, and law at Cal Poly Pomona. And he received his PhD from Price. And he's also just released his latest book, Keeping Races in Their Places, The Dividing Lines That Shaped the American City. And so if you're interested in redlining, I'd highly recommend you check out that video and then also the book. And then I'm going to let Anthony introduce Christian, unless you'd like me to.
No, I'm always happy to introduce Christian.
Excellent. I'm so glad that you were able to do this, Christian. Redistricting is such an important thing right now. So welcome, and I will disappear.
Thanks, Aubrey. And as usual, thank you to the Bedrosian Center for hosting this. It's really always a treat for me to work with them. And it's great to get our message out through them. So we always appreciate that. And by us, I mean all academics who get to work with them. Christian, me, everybody appreciates that. So Christian Grose is a professor of political science and public policy at USC. And I got to know Christian when I was a PhD student at USC, so we've known each other for a few years. He's also the academic director of the Schwarzenegger Institute for State and Global Policy, which is part of the reason why he was involved in this report, as the Schwarzenegger Institute was sponsoring that. And he's editor of the journal Research and Politics. He's a widely published political scientist in all the top journals, American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, all that kind of good stuff. So I won't do a long bio on him, but he's always been one of the political scientists I love reading and listening to. And he always helps me understand a lot of things that I don't understand. And gerrymandering is one of those things, because it's a pretty complicated topic, how redistricting works in all the different states. And it's a topic that's in the news right now. So we're excited to have him here to explain some of it to us and some of his findings about how it's working, particularly in California. So Christian, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Anthony, for having me, and to the Bedrosian Center for hosting the discussion on redistricting.
So before we dive into your report, I was hoping we could give the audience just a little bit of background. There's been a lot of research on redistricting and gerrymandering over the years. Maybe we could start by talking about why it matters. I mean, the motivation for why we should care so much about this. It's in the news a lot, but obviously political scientists have spent a lot of time trying to assess the extent to which it actually affects electoral outcomes. So could you talk a little bit about that, and maybe even a little bit about your personal interest in the topic?
Yeah, so I mean, redistricting is just a very hot topic. Sometimes I feel like it's of extreme interest to political scientists, a few other politicos, lawyers, et cetera, who pay attention, but it's really important to everybody, right? This is something that is super important to every constituent, every person living in the United States or living in California or wherever redistricting is being done. And so just to define it, like, what is redistricting? Redistricting is the redrawing of lines in single member districts where there are representatives representing voters, right? So we could think about this at the national level. In the US House, lines are redrawn every 10 years after the census in order to make population equal across the districts. In state legislatures, like in California, the Assembly and the Senate, the lines are redrawn every 10 years to make approximate equity in population across the state legislative districts. And then at the local level, in counties and cities all over the country, there's redistricting going on as well, where there are single member districts where there's one representative elected, again, to make population equity in terms of the same number of people across. And so the other thing I want to mention is, how did I get interested in this? So I grew up in North Carolina, which is, maybe the state that has had the most redistricting litigation in the last several decades of all U.S. states. I'd have to check that. I'm not sure if that's correct. But when I was growing up, I just found the redistricting process was incredibly important, both for voting rights and race and elections in the state in which I was living, that it kind of piqued my interest. And then I went to college, and in college, I wrote an undergraduate thesis about redistricting. And then I went to graduate school and I wrote a dissertation about redistricting, and so on. And I've done a lot of other topics beyond that. And then I'm doing some work on voting rights and redistricting now.
So can you give us an idea of if somebody is in charge of if somebody has influence or control over the process, how can they steer the redistricting in their favor as a politician?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple different things. So let's talk about just Congress, because I think that's something people are really interested in. Who controls Congress depends on who gets elected, and who gets elected depends on how the lines are drawn. So, what happens in most states, though not all states, is that the state legislature redraws the lines of congressional districts. They also redraw their own lines in most states. So this is where the legislature's job is to create the districts every decade that they are elected from, and to create the districts every decade that members of Congress are elected from. And so, going back to your question, like, how does that happen? What do they do? It depends on each state and it varies, but on balance, in most of the states that have legislators that redraw the lines, they have to draw the lines through both chambers, similarly to the way you would pass a bill. And it has to go through both chambers, and then a governor has to either sign it or veto it. And in states that there's a 2/3 veto override, the governor could actually be overridden by 2/3 of the legislature. But, in practice, that's getting into the weeds a little bit. But in practice, what happens is legislators get together and kind of divide up what they want. And sometimes they screw other legislators out of their district, right? Like maybe there's an unfavored legislator or an unfavored political party, and they'll get together and vote as a majority to sort of get rid of that one person they don't really like who got elected to their legislature. There's a few, anecdotes of that, or they might also try to engage in partisan gerrymandering. They are constrained by the Voting Rights Act. The legislatures themselves, even when redrawing lines, have to consider Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to make sure that there's an opportunity to elect candidates of choice of voters of color. So there's a lot of factors that go into it, but legislators in practice really do kind of have a Wild West mentality, because a lot of people don't pay attention to redistricting, outside of academics and some politicos. Legislators will redraw lines and do crazy things and help themselves get elected and help protect their party and all sorts of other goals too.
So speaking of the Voting Rights Act, we're going to talk in a little bit about racial and ethnic diversity and how that plays a role in California. Even with the protections of the Voting Rights Act, do we still find that there is racially motivated possibilities to redraw the lines in certain ways to avoid representation of certain groups as much as they could be represented in the process?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple things. Let me start, and then I'll get to the question with like what's the racial component that's required by federal law.
Mm-hmm.
So the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. It was amended subsequently a couple of times since then. There's one part of the Voting Rights Act that was gotten rid of by the Supreme Court about a decade ago, but there's still a lot of other parts of the Voting Rights Act, including something called Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And that says pretty specifically, going back to a court case in North Carolina in 1986, it says that if you can draw a district in which a minority group is a majority and that minority group regularly loses to the majority group. So envision, like a place like Alabama, where you've got white voters who are voting for one candidate, black voters who are voting for another candidate, white voters are regularly defeating black voters. If those instances hold, states are required to draw districts that will provide the opportunity or ability to elect candidates of choice of the minority group. And so I just want to specify that first, because that is federal law and everyone has to follow that. But how that's interpreted differs, right? So you've got states doing different things and interpreting that Voting Rights Act requirement differently. It also requires a lot of data analysis from social scientists and others. It requires a lot of legal analysis from lawyers. But like you could go to a place like Texas, take a look at what Texas did last decade and what they're doing in this decade. State legislature redrew the lines. Texas is a very racially and ethnically diverse state. In some ways, it reminds me a little bit of California, where the state is rapidly diversifying and already was diverse. And the the growth was pretty substantially, about 95% of the population growth from 2010 to 2020 in Texas is due to voters of color, and especially Latino voters and Asian American voters in particular. And so what did the legislature do? To comply with the Voting Rights Act, the legislature is saying that they are drawing what I would say are, and I haven't looked at it as closely as I could, so I'm a little hesitant to go too far, but I think it's a good example. They're packing a lot of minority voters into districts in sort of the Houston area and the Dallas area and elsewhere, so that surrounding districts then are more heavily white, right? And so that it's for lawyers and courts to decide if that's legal. But I think that's one way the Voting Rights Act has been used, probably not with the best intentions, but more to protect the legislators who were already in office. I think that's fair to say. And so voting rights is really important, but how it's implemented makes a difference. And so I mean, it's not clear to me that the Texas's implementation of the Voting Rights Act has been as clear and non-protective of incumbents as you might guess. I think there's a lot of litigation in Texas right now around their redistricting because they have not necessarily complied with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And so we'll see what ends up happening there. But then other ways to do this are to go and measure and consider, well, where is there growth in the minority community? Where are voters of color voting differently in racially polarized fashions from white voters? And if you drew a white majority district, would white voters defeat the candidate of choice of voters of color? And if so, then you've got to draw a district that will give an opportunity to elect voters of color preferred candidate or candidate of choice. And so, you see this in other states where that's happening more. So like California, who has a commission, which we haven't really talked about commissions yet, but the California Commission this go around, and to a lesser extent, I think 10 years ago also, if you look at the report I wrote, but this go around, they really worked on the Voting Rights Act components of the redistricting. And if you look at a lot of their decisions that were made, they measured, or they produced a report that showed where there's different voting rights needs for voting rights districts. And then the California Commission has produced more Latino majority districts than have ever existed in the state's history, right? And so that's another way to interpret the Voting Rights Act that was done in California.
So one last question before we get into the independent commission in more detail is, a couple times in what you've been talking about, you've referenced it's technical. It involves both legal technicality and spatial technicality. I mean, there's math involved in this, and there's geometry involved in this, and it's a game in a sense to try to, if you're really trying to rig these districts in certain ways where you have to be good at that kind of math. And so the question is about the public perception of that, because I know we're going to talk a little bit about how public perception of the independent commission has been, but do you get the sense that part of the issue here is because it's technical, it is difficult for a lot of Americans to wrap their heads around, and they often don't realize that a lot of this game is being played the way it's being played?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think it is technical, right? And so I'm trying not to get into the weeds, like remember in the audience, but I can get into the weeds really quickly on it. But there are all these components. Just straightforward geography, like you mentioned, Anthony, just people drawing maps, drawing districts, that requires a little bit of technical capacity to actually be able to draw lines. Now, I don't personally do that myself. I'm more of a statistical person, but you've got to have mappers. And then you have to have people who do the statistical analysis to analyze the Voting Rights Act part. You've got to have lawyers who make sure you're compliant with all the various regulations, right? Just in California alone, and this varies by state, the state law has various metrics that are rank ordered in terms of importance, like with Congress, number one being population equity, because that's required by federal law. Districts have to have the same number of people. Then voting rights compliance, so that there's fairness on the voting rights part, again, federal law. And then there's specific things about the state with communities of interest and compactness and other metrics that have to be examined when you're drawing lines. And that's just in California. Other states like Florida, state law does not allow the consideration of partisanship in the redrawing of the lines, even though the legislators are the ones who are responsible for drawing the lines. And so again, those are additional metrics that have to be potentially assessed. And then when you're legislators who are redrawing your own lines, you're going to be thinking about all the political dynamics, right? And so that some of that's just going to be impressionistic, because when you're an elected official, you kind of know you kind of know the constituency and the geography of the place and its politics, but you also have metrics, right? And people are going to be looking at things, and sometimes the metrics don't match what the legislators would actually want. And so the legislators will often end up doing things even though they should perhaps be following the metrics, right? So, I don't want to pick on a state, but in Florida in previous decade, there was this law that did not allow partisan considerations of drawing maps. But legislators did draw the maps and still do draw the maps. And this law was passed by ballot initiative by the voters to remove partisanship from a process that is by definition somewhat political. What ended up happening is legislators basically did not comply with that state law. They drew maps for partisan advantage, and then they went to court and they lost in court, and the maps had to be redrawn by the court, maybe in ways the legislators wouldn't want. So when it comes to legislators and these various laws that constrain them, they have to decide, do I want to draw the map that works for me the best partisan-wise or for my individual reelection? Or do I want to comply with the law? And then ideally, for a legislator, you want to comply with the law, because if you don't, someone else is going to draw the lines for you 2 years later, 4 years later, 6 years later, if you're unsuccessful in court. So one really big thing that's important about redistricting, in political science, we tend to focus on legislators want X, they want to get reelected, they want to help their party. Redistricting definitely does that, no question about it. But I think one thing I think we need to think about is the law constrains what legislators can do, and sometimes they ignore it, and then they get sued. And then sometimes they do it and they comply, and then the districts last for 10 years. And so I think that's where we are in a lot of if we look at the last decade of redistricting.
And with anything that's a legal challenge, they're taking a risk. It's not a binary choice. They don't know whether the courts are going to overturn them or not. How close do they want to skirt towards challenging the law and think they can get away with it? I imagine sometimes they're playing that kind of brinksmanship, and also bearing in mind who's on the court and whether they think that that judge is more likely to be favorable to them or not. I imagine that all plays into their strategy too.
Yeah, so if you look at the past decade again as a guide, right? So I've talked about a couple of these states that have been some of the worst at sort of engaging in partisan gerrymandering. At the Schwarzenegger Institute, we did a report I did it with 3 co-authors about the worst partisan gerrymanders from the last decade. So that's where I'm picking some of these cases from. But if you look at a place like Florida, where the legislators did draw a pretty partisan map in the last decade and they ended up getting sued, they were making a calculus that they might get to keep their map as drawn. There was a lot of litigation over partisan gerrymandering in the last decade. It ended up with Supreme Court decisions that basically said partisan gerrymandering is okay, right, at the federal level. There's no federal prohibition against partisan gerrymandering. And prior to that, a lot of work was being done to sort of create metrics to show that when partisan gerrymandering was the most extreme. Some law professors, political scientists were all working on creating this stuff. But at the end of the day, the Supreme Court said, we don't really want to get into this. We don't want to be involved in this. We don't think it's a federal issue. It is a state issue, right? So like if you're a legislator, say in North Carolina, and you're redrawing a map, and the North Carolina it's like a 52% Republican state, 48% Democratic state. There's a pretty large Black population, growing Latino population, so there's voting rights considerations in the state too. But if you're a legislator who wants to protect your district in North Carolina, or you want to protect the majority party, which is the Republicans in the case of North Carolina, you might say, well, how far can I go where a lawsuit's not going to be successful, right? And in the case of North Carolina, they've gone pretty far for many decades. Like going back to the 90s, Democrats were doing some pretty extreme stuff. Actually, the 80s, I would say, even to the 1980s, and probably diluting Black voters' power back in the 1980s. And then Republicans in the last couple of decades have been diluting Black voting power potentially, as well as Democrats. And so the North Carolina legislators are taking a risk. They're saying, I'm going to try to draw a district that helps me. And I'm going to hope that when it goes to court, it's going to end up like the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court said. And they're going to say partisan gerrymandering is okay and you can do it however you want, right? Or they take a risk and their lines get redrawn. So like in the case of North Carolina last decade, the U.S. Supreme Court said partisan gerrymandering is not against federal law. But then they said this is a state decision. So then the district map was taken to state court in North Carolina, and the state court in North Carolina ruled it ruled it as unconstitutional to the state constitution, and they had to redraw their lines. And they didn't get to choose their lines because they were put in. Actually, I don't recall exactly what happened there, but they didn't get the lines they wanted, but it took a decade for that court case to actually happen. So there's a big risk, but legislators are going to take big risks because this is so technical that a lot of times people aren't paying attention.
So if those state level constraints are really where a lot of the binding constraints are on the process, like in Florida, like the ruling unconstitutional at the state level, how often does that change? How often are we seeing ballot initiatives like the one in Florida, like the one we're going to talk about in a minute in California? And how much is redistricting done the way that it's always been done in a lot of these states?
Yeah, so there are opportunities for change, and there's been a lot of change in the redistricting space over the last couple of decades. So even though this is a technical issue, this has gotten a lot of attention, right? So, going back to in California when Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor, he took this on as a huge thing in California where he didn't like the way that the legislators redrew their lines. He worked with a coalition of Common Cause, Charles Munger Jr., people who generally are kind of nonpartisan, a little bit on the left, a little bit on the right, who basically wanted reform. And then the legislators were opposed, right? And the legislators didn't want reform. And California is a ballot initiative state. So you take a reform measure to the ballot and you say, we're going to get rid of legislators drawing the lines. We're going to have a commission draw the lines. And there's actually a pretty specific process for how it's done in California. And then that passed, and it passed for state legislature and it passed for Congress. And so we've now had 2 cycles because of a ballot initiative that passed way back in the late 2000s. And so that's happened all across the country. California was one of the first to do that ballot initiative. And then you see it happening elsewhere. And they're not exactly the same, and the commissions vary. But there's been changes in Florida, as I mentioned, that happened via ballot initiative, not for a commission, but to constrain partisan gerrymandering. There's a ballot initiative, to my knowledge, in Arkansas that's likely to go on the ballot in 2022 to make its redistricting be done by commission. Ohio had a reform effort that we can discuss in greater detail. Michigan had a reform ballot initiative to get rid of the legislative drawn lines and to replace it with commissions that did succeed, and they had their first commission draw the lines just recently, a few weeks ago. And that's kind of been going across the country, California, Michigan, other places with different reform efforts. And most of the ballot initiative states, the place where you can change the rules or the laws via ballot initiative, have moved towards some barrier to partisan gerrymandering, commission-drawn process, or whatever. And then the rest of the states tend to not have ballot initiatives, and those are the states where the legislatures still draw their lines, because very rarely will you find state legislators willing to give up and cede control of their line drawing opportunity to somebody else, right? So basically we're in a state of a world where, maybe about a quarter or a third of the states via ballot initiative have reformed their redistricting process so that legislators have some constraints or don't draw the lines at all, like in California, and then about 2/3 of the states where legislators draw the lines.
So since this is coming out of ballot initiative in a lot of the states, let's come back to that issue of public perception. Our friend and colleague at USC, John Matsusaka, has done a lot of work on direct democracy. And one of the arguments that comes out of a lot of his evidence is that when the people get to vote directly for something via ballot initiative, they're more likely to be supportive of it down the road than if a government bureaucrat makes that decision for them, because they actually voted directly themselves. Do you think that these ballot initiatives have changed the public perception of redistricting and their perception of the fairness of the process in states like California?
Yeah, I think so. I agree with John Matsusaka's premise there, especially when it comes to redistricting commissions, right? So California passed the redistricting commission back in 2010, as I mentioned. And, that by itself is the voters choosing to create a commission, not to have legislators redraw the lines for Congress and for state legislature and for Board of Equalization districts also. And so that by itself is the voters saying, we don't want legislators to draw the lines. Now, I've done some research just recently with Matthew Nelson, who's a PhD student here at USC, and we did a survey of California voters, And, this is, even though voters voted for the ballot initiative, we can't assume that everyone knows how the process works right now. So what we did is we did a survey experiment where some of the survey respondents got information about how California's process works. We described the selection procedures. We described that there's 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 4 independents on the California Commission. They're citizens. They're not affiliated with legislators, right? Like just completely independent from the legislature. We described that process and then asked them, do they think it's fair? Asked them for some other questions about just their attitudes towards redistricting. And then we asked other California voters who weren't given that information at all, what do you think? And then we also asked people, if legislators draw the line, what do you think? And so, not surprising, just the simple act of having a commission with 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 independents, that actually caused voters in California to say, I think the way that we do things is fair. The outcomes don't matter. Outcomes might be what they want, might not be what they want. But the idea that there is a commission that is balanced 5D, 5R, 4I, that made voters, increase their perceptions of fairness by, if I recall, over 20 percentage points in our survey, compared to the voters who didn't. They actually rated things low. Because on balance, you ask voters about institutions, government, trust is low, they rate things low. The commission itself, giving people information about how commission works, made people more likely to value the commission as its process.
Can we talk a little more about how that commission works? So aside from just how many Republicans and how many Democrats, how are they chosen? How is the commission put together? How often does it change, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I want to add, I'm going to describe California's, and California's is different than other states. And so if you're in a state that is not California right now and you have a redistricting commission, the process is going to be a little bit different. And I do think the frontier of reform efforts might be around how a commission should operate, not just if there is a commission or not. But in California, the process is relatively straightforward. And the point is to try to keep it as independent as possible from the legislature. The first step is there's an application call. The Bureau of Audits, a bureaucratic state agency, is in charge of this, and the state auditor issues the call. Lots of people apply, and then the auditor selects a group. The auditor selects 1 Republican auditor, 1 Democratic auditor, 1 independent auditor who works in the Bureau of Audits at the state in Sacramento to basically be the committee to review the files. And then they pick a large number of applicants who look pretty good, and then they interview them and reduce that down. And then and again, they have to be equal in terms of D, R, and I, with 5D, 5R, 4I at the end of the day. And then there also has to be racial, ethnic, gender, and geographic diversity. So you can't have a commission with, everybody from LA County, or that's primarily, mostly white people, or you've got to have the diversity of the state in all sorts of forms as part of the consideration in selecting the 14 commissioners. And so then the legislature does get a say. The legislature gets to weigh in and knock some people off of the list that the Bureau of Audits has come up with. And then at the very end, this is like, for somebody who's really into randomization in my own research and experiments, the commission's first members are drawn by lot. So they literally take ping pong balls, the Bureau of State Audits takes ping pong balls like you would in a lottery, and numbers pop up, and it's and those are the first people selected. So they basically pick a really good pool of qualified applicants with all the different balance that I mentioned, and then they do some bingo ball picking. And then the last 6 are selected by the first 8 who are drawn. And that's important, especially for considering diversity and other issues. So this year, the bingo balls, even though the final pool was really diverse racially and ethnically, the bingo balls did not pick, the bingo balls picked a diverse group of Black, Asian American, and white commissioners, but it did not pick any Latino commissioners. And so that was a bit of a concern at that stage. And so then the commissioners noted that, and most of the final 6 commissioners were Latino and make sure there was balance in terms of ethnic representation and partisan representation, and also geographic representation. So there are some counties that didn't have representation that are pretty large that got selected at the end of the process. And so at the end of the day, the commission's 14 people. This particular commission was 14 people, relatively gender balanced, partisan balanced entirely, 5R, 5D, 4I, and probably the most racially and ethnically diverse commission in the country ever, I think. I mean, I'd have to verify that, but pretty significant proportion of Latino, Asian American, Black, and then also other groups too, like LGBTQ groups, geographic diversity, people from Berkeley, people from Orange County, people from rural Central Valley, right? Like a lot of things like that were part of the factor too. So all these things kind of go in to the input, and then at the end, you're left with 14 people.
So let's talk about the effects that this has then. First of all, when political scientists are thinking about, I mean, you look at something like this and you think, oh, great, natural experiment. I'm a social scientist too, so I know, okay, ballot initiative has changed some things. We can do a before and after. What are the outcomes that pops into a political scientist's mind first of all? What are the outcomes that you think would be affected by changing the redistricting process and that you might actually have the data to measure?
Yeah, I mean, I have one idea that I think if you're actually drawn randomly into the process, that you might change your own attitude. You might learn a lot compared to the people that weren't randomly drawn into the commission. You might learn more about the state than you would if you weren't. But that's not what you're asking. But there are a lot of outcomes that could change. Commissions versus legislatures are pretty big differences, and it's really interesting because the political science research is pretty mixed on this. So there's a lot of political science research that finds commissions, legislatures, the partisan outcomes are pretty similar, right? Like if it's a Democratic state, Democrats are going to win. If it's a Republican state, Republicans are going to win. And then, there is some other research that shows that may be true, but then that's not entirely the case, right? So in some of the work I've done, I think some of the most extreme partisan gerrymandering is reduced in commission states. So these cases of what I would call minority rule, where one party wins more than 50% of the votes in a state, but gets less than 50% of the seats in a state, I think that's less likely to happen in a commission, because the legislatures have more of an incentive to do that, while commissions just simply don't have that kind of incentive to engage in that. The other thing I think that is really different that I think we as political scientists need to be studying more, and I would encourage scholars, students, others to study this. I think most legislative redistricting processes are relatively less transparent, less open than commissions processes. And this does differ depending on the state, right? Or again, if we want to think about this at the local level even, when a city council is engaging in redistricting versus a commission that is redrawing the lines of a city, the commission itself, by its nature, is embedding in a lot more public comment, embedding in more public meetings. Again, not to pick on North Carolina, which I keep doing, the North Carolina legislature this go around had a few public hearings, but not very many, right? And the legislature redrew the lines. And then there was a court case last week that where a legislator admitted he had some secret maps that he was consulting that were not released to the public, right? So that's a legislative process that I just, the sort of secrecy level, and it makes sense, to be honest. I mean, legislators, if they're not required to, are not going to be as upfront about what they're doing. But I think in commission states, there's more opportunity for feedback, information, even like kind of searching for the optimal outcome. And so it takes longer. It's a little bit messier. It's not always perfect, actually, but you can see what's happening on a commission when they're redrawing the lines, and you don't always see that in a legislature.
Speaking of that kind of transparency, how much do they give us a window into their actual methodology, explaining how they're going about drawing the lines and why they drew them where they did? I mean, it's one thing to be able to see the maps and comment on them, but it's an entirely different thing to say, okay, did you follow an algorithm? What was the process step by step?
You're talking about legislators now?
No, sorry. I don't expect legislators to explain any of that. No, for the independent commission in a place like California.
Yeah, I mean, okay, got it. So, I mean, the commissioners, I think that varies a lot too, right? So if you look at the commissions across the country, Ohio has what's called a politician commission. So the people who are appointed to the commission are elected officials. So the governor is on it, and some legislators themselves are on it. was 5 R's, 2 D's. And, that wasn't the most transparent commission. They also didn't really explain what they were doing. And it's kind of led to some political headaches out of it as well. But I'll use that as just one example. Not all commissions are necessarily transparent. So I don't want to suggest that, commissions transparent, legislature is secret, and commissions are explaining their processes all the time, and legislatures aren't. But I do think commissions are more likely to than legislatures, right? And so, what's the process in Ohio? I'm not sure, because they're being pretty secretive, right? So every commission is not explaining their processes, and that's an example of one that's not really explaining its processes. In other examples, right? So California had its final meetings in December around its commission process. The commissioners had statements, they spoke, they talked about why they were doing things. Some of them, I didn't watch all the meetings, but I watched some of the meetings. And, when I tuned into the meetings, there'd be a lot of discussion about redrawing lines and kind of back and forth. And if you wanted to go back and kind of process their decisions, you could. It's all on video, right? All those meetings are on Zooms that people can go back and look at. And the same thing is true in Michigan with its redistricting commission and otherwise, and then you have states like New Jersey. New Jersey just produced a map, came out of nowhere, and they passed it. And I don't know what their process was, because there aren't videos of meetings and tapes to do so. And so I think the commission process varies by state, and some states have been much more open at producing their commission procedures and decision making than others.
So let's talk about the maps themselves then. How have the congressional maps in California changed from 2000, before we had the independent commission, through 2010, and now the latest maps that were just drawn in December?
Yeah, so they've changed a lot, right? If you go all the way back to 2000 and even the 1990s in California, there were legislators were redrawing lines for sure. In the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, political scientists have written about this, journalists have written about this. There were certain state legislators that were just known for protecting each other's districts. And so if you go back to 2000, one anecdote of what happened, and I talk about this in one of the research papers I've written, and it's a well-known anecdote, but there were, San Fernando Valley, which is an area of Los Angeles that was, from the period of the 90s, 2000s to 2010s, was diversifying. Latino growth was already, lots of Latino voters had already lived in San Fernando Valley for a long time, but it was becoming even more Latino than it had over this series of decades. What happened in 2002 is white legislators who were Democrats wanted to protect their seats in the San Fernando Valley. So they made sure that they split Latino voters enough that white Democrats could continue to be elected, both to Congress and to the state legislature. And that's what happened, right? And so there was some splitting of Latino voters in that area of Los Angeles in order to protect incumbents, most of whom were white incumbents, white Democratic incumbents. Then you fast forward to 2012, there's a commission. Commission isn't as concerned about protecting those incumbents. And in the case of Congress, draws 2 white Democratic incumbents together who were very powerful and had played a role in drawing the lines previously. And they had to run against each other. And a new district was created that was Latino, had an ability to elect Latino voters. And then that elected a new representative who's a Latino legislator. You look at areas like the San Gabriel Valley, east of Los Angeles, the same story. You go back to the 1990s, you go back to the 2000s. Asian American voters are large and significant parts of the San Gabriel Valley in terms of voting power, but the district lines are drawn to basically divide the Asian American community when the legislators are redrawing the lines, mostly to protect, incumbents again, most of the incumbents who were white. And then the commission comes along, and the commission draws a district in 2012 that has a significant proportion of Asian American voters that could provide the ability to elect Asian American candidates of choice, and it did in that district. And so one of the things that we see when you go back in time is the protection of legislators. And then there's also like a voting rights and a race component of that protection too, because California diversified during that time. But the 2002 redistricting especially, incumbents want to protect themselves. And so there's a real lag to the elected officials looking like the voters of California compared to how the electorate was actually changing. And that was because of redistricting. And then the legislature redrawing the lines. And then the commission basically upended it, and they weren't as concerned about incumbents. And different people got elected, and there's greater racial and ethnic diversity that occurred, especially among Latino representation and Asian American representation in the 2012 redistricting to the president.
So you think it is fair to say from the research that changing the maps does actually matter in the actual election outcomes then, in terms of diversity and possibly in terms of partisanship and other things?
Yeah, I think political scientists have focused too much on the type of redistricting and its effect on partisan outcomes. It's an important question. Its effect on incumbency, it's also an important question. But what I think we've looked at less is its effect on racial and ethnic diversity and also on the protection of voting rights. And so in the report that I wrote, I make that argument. I want to point out some work by Sarah Sadwani, who's a USC PhD student. She was also a redistricting commissioner this last go around, or she is currently a redistricting commissioner still, I think. And Jane Jun, a USC professor, they wrote an article in PS Political Science and Politics a few years ago that showed the same thing. The redistricting commission in California increased the racial and ethnic diversity of elected officials. So I think we need to be looking at the impact of commissions on not just changing partisan outcomes, but how does it change racial and ethnic representation? How does it change who is elected? They might all be Democrats. They might all be Republicans, depending on the state. But are the types of Ds and Rs who are getting elected different? And I think that generally the research is showing that. And then we're going to, we'll have to see what happens after the 2022 cycle. We have a lot more commissions and a lot more data, and that might not be the case after 2022. Or it might be, right? In California, there's a lot more of an attempt to think about voting rights from the commission this go round. And so there may be increased diversity coming out of California. I don't know about other states with other commissions though.
So there are really two levels of diversity that we're talking about. One is the commission itself has been, if I understand what you're saying, it has, and this was part of your report, it has become more and more diverse to more represent the state compared to previous years and decades, and compared to what the legislature looked like that was drawing the lines. And then the second piece is because the process has changed, the actual elected officials as a whole have become more diverse and more representative of California's diversity. Is it fair to say that on both levels?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely who's drawing the lines under the commission this past year is much more diverse, not just race and ethnicity, but geography, backgrounds, gender, than has ever happened in a legislature, like without question. Because you go back to 2002, when the legislature was redrawing the lines, there was a bunch of Democrats, most of whom were white, many of whom were guys. That's who was redrawing the lines in 2002. 2012, different, more diverse on all the different dimensions we talked about. 2022, the Redistricting Commission in California, very diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, and party because of the 5R, 5D, 4 independent requirement. And so without question, the people drawing the lines are more diverse in 2021 than they were in 2001 and 2002. And then in terms of the outcomes, what the report finds is that after the 2012 commission, there was greater diversity of elected officials in the California state legislature and Congress, especially among Asian Americans and Latinos. The percentage of Latino and Asian American representatives nearly doubled after the commission was implemented in California compared to when the legislature redrew the lines in 2002.
Wow. Okay, that is a big effect. Is it too much of a stretch as a social scientist to then say one more step, whether there's a causal effect on actual policy outcomes? Or is that something that people have started thinking about?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I mean, I'm talking a lot about what we call descriptive representation in political science, which is just, the appearance of diversity, right? Not necessarily diversity in terms of policy outcomes or substantive outcomes, but who is elected and are they representing diverse racial, ethnic, and other backgrounds, gender, et cetera. There is some research in political science. I wrote a book about it. Some other people have done similar work that argues that, when you change who's in office and you have increases in racial and ethnic minority groups in office, when you have increases in more women in office, you end up with different substantive outcomes. That's a contested literature. Some people don't agree with that, but I'd say on balance, most of the literature argues that changing the demographics of a legislature actually leads to differences in policy outcomes too. Some of that is though still constrained by party. Most of the research also shows political party is way more important for substantive outcomes and what policy gets passed than the race, ethnicity, or gender of those who are elected. So all those descriptive characteristics are sort of like a secondary thing that changes policy outcomes in terms of its overall how influential it is. And one of the key variables in determining what happens in a legislature is the political party and which party controls the chamber.
This is related in my mind a little bit to some of the broader lessons that I'm trying to extract from this. Having written my book on redlining, now I'm seeing connections between, that's why we do the series, between different types of dividing lines. And so, for example, one thing that I'm wondering about is if you wind up redistricting in a way that privileges some groups over others, do you then wind up with, in terms of policy outcomes, money being allocated toward some districts more than others because certain incumbents have more power than others, or they want to move money toward their favored groups and where they happen to live? In other words, when we think about things like school segregation and access to capital and housing discrimination and all these things that are localized, is it fair to think that redistricting historically could have played a role in some of those policy outcomes?
Oh yeah, definitely. So you go back to, I think the best examples are the South, the U.S. South, though I think this would apply anywhere. You go back to the U.S. South in the 1950s, the 1960s. This is when like a state like Georgia was not redrawing its legislative lines regularly. And when it did, Atlanta got 1 or 2 or 3 districts. And then the nearby county, 5 counties over that only had about 2,000 residents, got 1 district also. Like dramatic population inequities in districting, which is now against the law. So like since the Supreme Court has said in the 1960s that's against the law, but at the time it wasn't. So you go all the way back to then. There's a lot of research, some work by Stephen and Sullivan and co-authors that shows, places like Atlanta, when there was wild inequity in the redistricting and the rural parts of Georgia got way more districts, they also got way more of the spending from the state, right? The budget that the state is spending on infrastructure is so much better for places that at that time were mostly white or whiter than some of the cities and the areas in Atlanta. And so like gerrymandering made a difference on spending, and it made a difference on spending by racial group, where Black voters were really not just disfranchised at the redistricting level, but disfranchised in terms of the allocation of funds from the state, right? And then I find some of that in my book also that I wrote, Congress in Black and White, about racial redistricting. And I find that when districts are redrawn and you create Black ability to elect districts or Black opportunity to elect districts where Black voters are more likely to elect candidates of choice, those are the districts where federal funds tend to be allocated at the congressional level. Federal funds tend to be allocated more frequently to historically Black colleges and universities, more frequently to geographic areas that have higher Black populations. And then when the districts previously had been drawn that were mostly white majority districts to elect white candidates that were preferred by white voters, then areas where white voters live were those that benefited most from federal spending. So there's definitely a connection between how the lines are drawn, who gets elected, and what gets spent on and where resources flow.
So thinking about improving this going forward, it would be wonderful if we could come away from this talk and say, well, independent commissions solve everything. But clearly there's a variation in just how independent commissions are operated across the country. There seems to be, on average, some better outcomes, but there's big differences in terms of transparency and processes and even representation on those commissions. So when you think about what are the policy takeaways for how states should be thinking about doing this better, and specifically about, thinking about the details about it, not just saying an independent commission will solve everything. What would you recommend to states that might want to draw up a ballot initiative and change the way that they do things going forward? Yeah,
that's a good question, because I think we've sort of moved past the the reform efforts around redistricting in the policy community has tended to be in the past, legislators shouldn't draw the lines and we should create a commission. But like, what does that commission look like? You're getting at there's a wide variation of what commissions look like. And I think as political scientists, we haven't done a very good job of distinguishing between types of commissions. If you look at the research that's been done, people put in like dummy variables for commissions and look at outcome differences, or they might vary an independent citizens commission like in California, and contrast that to a more politician commission like in Ohio. But other than that, we haven't really gotten into the weeds on like what works the best with commissions. And so, I would guess we're going to see some reform efforts even in states that have redistricting commissions about how could it be done better, right? And what are some of the better ways to do it? I think that one of the key goals should be for a commission, how do you get input from as many people as possible in as public a way as possible, right? So as long as you're able to have lots and lots of people communicate to the commission, and the commission is hearing and debating and deliberating and doing so in a public meeting, that's really good, right? That's the kind of commission process that you want. And so I would aim for that. I also think the number of commissioners might be something to think about too, right? So you look at Arizona. Arizona has a redistricting commission with only 5 members. 2 of them are Democrats, 2 of them are Republicans, and the chair is not affiliated with either party. And in terms of in terms of the party registration. And then in a state like California, where you've got 5 Ds, 5 Rs, and 4 Is, 14 versus 5. Maybe 5 is too small. Maybe you want a few more people so there's a few more voices in the room. I know in Arizona, even though it's got a significantly, Arizona has a significant Latino and Native American population. 4 of the commissioners were white, and 1 of them was Native American, and there were no Latinos on the Arizona Redistricting Commission. So that might be something you'd want to reconsider, right, in a state like Arizona. Maybe you want to add more commissioners so you could have greater diversity than exist in the current commission setup, maybe a little bit more like California, right? So I think there's a lot of different ways to think about reforming commissions via ballot initiative that could be done. Although I'd also just be, for those who are fans of redistricting commissions and the reforms around redistricting commissions, I would caution people about making significant reforms, because I think we're going to also see a lot of legislator-led like reform movements to change commissions because they don't have control over the process. And it's going to appear to be a reform, but it may in fact actually be an attempt by legislators to take back more of their power to redraw lines in states where they're a commission.
Even in a situation where you have a lot of public comment opportunities, there might still be difficulty because, as we talked about, the technical nature of it. I mean, I can even recall where I live when I started seeing the new redistricting maps and they said, we want your input. My initial thought was, I don't know how to judge them. What would my input be? So as a voter, how would you think about going into a meeting or a hearing like that? What would be on your mind as the types of things you want to keep your antenna up for and the types of input that you should be providing to the people who are drawing the maps?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it all sounds good to be like, have comment made public and have people talk. But yeah, you're like, what are you going to go say? I mean, I'll use an example. I hope he doesn't mind. But I was talking to my neighbor about redistricting a few months ago. And he was like, what's going on? I think our district got changed in this way. And I don't want to be with this neighborhood. I think we're more like this other neighborhood. And I was like, you should actually put a public comment in and say that like that. And so that's the kind of thing where if you look and you say, I have a well-defined community. This is my neighborhood in which I live. This neighborhood and these other neighborhoods are well-defined communities. This is the people who live here on the ground. This is how we think of our communities. That's the kind of public comment that you make. And he ended up writing a comment. I believe that, I don't know if his comment made a difference, but I believe they did tweak the boundaries of our district a little bit. And so, not every public comment is listened to, of course. But I think that's one way. Another way is to think about macro things that you care about. So maybe you don't care that, this freeway boundary should be where a neighborhood stops and starts or something like that. And it might be more macro and you just want particularly types of representation. You want certain kinds of fairness, or you want, districts that look a certain way. You can make comments like that too and try to weigh in. And we do see some of that. We see a lot of that with all the, whether it's legislatures or commissions, you can, of course, always make comments. But, I think it's important to I think it's important to try to like weigh in as much as you can on the process if you're a voter.
It's actually really interesting to hear a social scientist say that the feeling of community should matter. But it's interesting to me because we hear a lot of people now saying, why can't we just turn it into an algorithm? Now we have the statistical abilities. Why do we even need discretion in the drawing of the maps? There should be a way to just have a computer do it. And maybe that would be the least biased way to do that. Is a counter argument to that it really does matter how a community feels and who people feel like they belong to, and that should be a part of the process in addition to statistical inputs?
Yeah, that's definitely it. I mean, I think there's two responses to that. I mean, someone's writing the algorithm, first of all, right? So some algorithmic approach to redrawing maps, someone had to put the initial inputs and starting values into the algorithm to draw the maps. Who that person is might have biases. So what might appear to be an unbiased algorithm may in fact actually be something that embeds biases that are worse than what you might do if you had people in sort of a messy process of give and take and submitting public comments and talking and debating as legislators or commissioners. And so I'm not a huge fan of the algorithmic approach because I think the algorithmic approaches often tend to forget about voting rights. They sort of just like throw some districts out there and they're not thinking about the voting rights implications or some other representational implications. And so I think that's one reason you don't want to necessarily just go and like hit enter on a computer, right, and just see what comes out. On the other hand, I agree with you also, though, too, separate from that critique of algorithms, right? Like community input is not going to be hitting enter on a computer. Community input is going to be different groups on the ground saying these are the kinds of neighborhoods that matter to me and the places in which I live and the kinds of districts I'd like to have drawn. Those community inputs are not always going to end up working. Not everyone's going to get what they want in redistricting. One of the most common things that I've always heard in redistricting is not everyone will be happy and not everyone will get what they want. But like the idea that you have some input into the process seems to matter. And so I do think that's a reason not to have algorithms.
Yeah, and that point I think is important because it also comes back to what we were saying earlier about diversity, which is that there are actually two reasons. There are a lot of reasons, but there are two general reasons that we're talking about to care about diversity. And they're the same two reasons to care about community input. One is the instrumental value that if we have more diversity, if we have more community input, we think the outcomes will be better. But the other is that we believe that that should be a part of the process. People have more faith in the system when there's more diversity and when they have input. And that in itself is good. Is that fair, what I'm hearing from you?
Yeah, and I actually want to step back just for a minute. So I'm not like anti-algorithm entirely. I want to make that clear. I just think like I do hear a lot of times from people saying, why don't we just let a computer do it all? I think a computer can't do it all. I do think algorithms provide us with a lot of information about partisan fairness, racial fairness, voting rights. There's a lot of really good work that does use algorithms that will measure all of those outcomes and make sure that there's legal compliance. And I think those are excellent algorithms and I endorse them. So I just want to step back and not be like totally anti-algorithm. I think algorithms can't start the process and just simply produce a map. And so I think everything you said as a result of that, I agree with.
So the last question I want to ask as we wrap up our hour here is, this report and a lot of the work that you've been doing on this is supported through the Schwarzenegger Institute that you're the academic director for. And I gather that a lot of that comes out of the fact that this is an issue that Governor Schwarzenegger has cared about for a long time. And so I wanted to ask what else you're working on at the Schwarzenegger Institute. What kind of research going forward can people expect to find when they're reading your website and keeping up with what you're up to?
Yeah, that's great. So the USC Schwarzenegger Institute was created in 2012 at the Price School of Public Policy at USC when Governor Schwarzenegger stepped down as governor. He wanted a space for work on political reform issues like the things we're talking about, redistricting, other topics. He's a huge fan of redistricting. He loves it. He thinks it's really interesting. His tagline is always to terminate gerrymandering. That's what he said when he was promoting the ballot initiative to put a commission on the ballot. And even now, he's doing a lot of stuff around the country to sort of work on different reforms in different places. And so what are we going to do at the Institute? We're doing a lot of work on voting rights. We're not focused entirely on redistricting. So, I would look for some work on voting rights and election administration that we did back in 2020 that we're also doing now. I'm doing some research on that topic, but the Institute's going to be coming out with some interesting stuff there. We also do a lot of work on the environment. and public policy around the environment. And then we also do some work on a number of other topics, partnering with people at the Price School, partnering with practitioners in California and elsewhere. But a lot of work on political reforms, environmental policy, and then we're going to be doing a bit more on some voting rights initiatives coming soon.
Great. I'm excited to see it. Well, thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for explaining a lot of it to us today. It's been fascinating for me, and I'm sure everybody else enjoyed it as well. Always a pleasure, Christian. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Good to see you.
Yep, you too. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you to the Bedrosian Center for hosting us. And we'll try to keep this series going with other events like it. In the meantime, you can always check us out on the Bedrosian website, where I'm sure they'll post a copy of the report we've been discussing today. Thanks, everybody.